Before you listen closely, there is no need to listen at all. Nothing here requires attention. Nothing here asks you to follow a line of thought or hold an idea in place. This is not the beginning of an argument. It is not the start of a lesson. It is simply a space where the mind is allowed to loosen its grip. You may notice that even now, part of you is waiting for meaning, waiting for a point, waiting for something that signals what matters. That habit did not begin tonight. It arrives with you. Most days are built around evaluation. You move from one moment to the next, measuring progress, checking direction, adjusting effort. Even rest is often measured. Timed, justified. Planned around what comes after. So when nothing asks for evaluation, the mind can feel uncertain. That uncertainty is not a problem. It is a sign that the usual structure has momentarily relaxed. You do not need to correct it. There is nothing you should be doing better. Right now, no posture to fix, no breathing to manage, no state to achieve. If your thoughts wander, let them. If they pause, let them pause. The night does not demand clarity. At this hour, the mind does not move forward in clean lines. It drifts. It revisits fragments. It circles familiar sensations without asking what they mean. This is not distraction. It is transition, a slow shift away from vigilance. You may notice that your attention comes and goes in waves, present for a sentence, absent for the next, then present again without effort. That rhythm is welcome here. Nothing in what follows depends on continuity. The story will not punish you for missing pieces. It will not test memory. It will not reward comprehension. It exists alongside your thoughts, not in competition with them. As the minutes pass, you may feel the body change in small ways, a heaviness that was not there before, a sense that holding tension requires more effort than releasing it. These changes do not need to be noticed. To happen, the body knows how to settle. When it is not being directed, this opening is not meant to prepare you for what comes next. It is meant to remove the sense that you must be prepared at all. Preparation belongs to the day. At night, the mind does not need to stay ready. You may still feel alert now. That is normal. Alertness does not disappear suddenly. It fades when it is no longer fed. Nothing here feeds it. There are no instructions to follow, no expectations to meet, no conclusions to reach. Just sound moving through space. You might notice moments where silence feels longer than you expect. Those moments are not empty. They are where the mind stops checking itself. During the day, the mind asks questions constantly. Am I doing this right? Am I falling behind? Did I miss something? At night, those questions lose urgency. They soften. They fade. You do not need to answer them. If a thought arises and dissolves before finishing, nothing is lost. Completion is not required here. Incomplete thoughts are allowed to rest. This is a place where nothing needs to justify itself. Not your pace, not your attention, not your state of mind. If you feel tired, that is not something to fix. If you feel restless, that does not need explanation. The night accepts both without asking why. As listening turns into background, and background turns into something quieter, the mind begins to release its habit of monitoring. Monitoring takes energy, and when it stops, space appears. That space may feel unfamiliar at first. It is the space where evaluation pauses, where nothing is being scored, where no verdict is forming. You are not expected to arrive anywhere from here. There is no destination, only a gradual easing of effort. Soon the story will begin to speak more clearly, not loudly, not urgently. It will not demand agreement or understanding. It will simply continue, whether you are listening or drifting. For now, allow the effort of staying alert to soften. Allow the sense of waiting to loosen. Nothing is about to be required of you. And when the story begins in earnest, it will do so without asking you to be ready. Not every trial has a courtroom. Not every sentence is spoken out loud. Some verdicts arrive without a judge, without witnesses, without an audience. They happen in silence. Rome understood this long before its walls began to crumble. The empire did not last because its laws were perfect. It lasted because people learned how to judge themselves. Before anyone else had to, Rome's most durable invention was not legislation. It was self-accusation. People learned to stand alone, to review their own behavior, to replay their choices, to interrogate their thoughts, as if an authority were always watching. Eventually, the authority was no longer external. It lived inside. You no longer needed someone to tell you that you were wrong. You asked yourself first. When something fails, you don't immediately ask what went wrong in the system. You ask what went wrong in you. When progress stalls, you don't question the structure. You question your effort. When exhaustion arrives, you don't see it as a signal. You see it as a flaw. No one taught you these sentences explicitly. No one sat you down and trained you to think this way. You absorbed it quietly. That is Rome's deepest victory. Not obedience enforced by fear, not compliance extracted by punishment, but a way of thinking where failure automatically feels personal and success always feels conditional. Rome did not need to follow you. It taught you to follow yourself. Empires usually collapse when people stop believing in them. Rome collapsed when people stopped noticing it, because Rome learned something more effective than domination. If you shape how people interpret their experiences, you never have to give orders again. Behavior changes with pressure. Beliefs fracture under stress. But habits survive everything. Rome did not simply rule territory, it trained perception. Slowly, patiently, across generations, people learned that mistakes were not neutral events. They were evidence. Evidence of carelessness, of weakness, of moral failure. And once that association was internalized, control became automatic. Tonight's story is not about emperors or armies. Those things are already silent. Tonight is about the machinery that kept running. Long after the empire stopped breathing, the invisible courtroom, the one you carry with you, where every decision is reviewed, every pause feels suspicious, every rest requires justification. You wake up each day already under evaluation, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. You monitor your productivity. You measure your worth. You rehearse explanations for failures that haven't happened yet. And it all feels normal. That is the unsettling part. Rome did not teach people to fear punishment. It taught them to fear being wrong, to fear being seen as insufficient, unreliable, undisciplined. So people learned to preempt judgment. They disciplined themselves harder than any authority ever could. They questioned their instincts. They softened their opinions. They hesitated before speaking, even when silence cost them more than honesty ever would. Not because they were weak, but because caution felt safer than freedom. Over time, this inner trial never adjourned. There was no verdict of innocence, only temporary reprieves. You could be doing well, but never finished. You could be successful, but never secure. You could rest, but only with guilt humming quietly in the background. Rome did not promise peace. It promised order. And order, once internalized, does not need guards. This is not history you memorize. This is history you live inside. It explains why modern life feels heavy even when nothing is overtly wrong. Why people apologize for existing. Why stillness feels uncomfortable. Why self-criticism feels responsible. Why freedom often feels less like relief and more like exposure. Because when the trial never ends, certainty becomes dangerous. Tonight we are not here to pass judgment. We are here to recognize the courtroom, to notice the language, the assumptions, the inherited rules that were never consciously chosen. Because once you see the trial, you can stop mistaking it for truth. So lower the lights. Let the world quiet down. Rome is about to speak again. Not in Latin, not through laws, but through the voice in your head. That insists you are always just one mistake away from being found guilty. And it has been speaking for a very long time. When mistakes became moral failures, Rome did not treat mistakes as technical problems. That idea came much later. In the Roman world, an error was rarely neutral. It was not simply something that went wrong. It was something that revealed who you were. If a task failed, the failure did not end with the task. It traveled backward, attaching itself to the person. A missed deadline was not poor timing. It suggested laziness. A procedural error was not confusion. It suggested carelessness. A bad outcome was not misfortune. It hinted at flawed character. Rome slowly transformed mistakes from events into evidence. This shift mattered more than any law. Because once error becomes moral, correction is no longer enough. You don't fix the action. You fix the self. And fixing the self never truly ends. Early Roman systems were built on discipline rather than forgiveness. The empire depended on predictability. Predictability depended on compliance, and compliance depended on internal pressure. People needed to believe that doing things incorrectly was not just inconvenient, but shameful. So Rome encouraged a subtle equation. Wrong action meant weak discipline. Weak discipline meant unreliable character. Unreliable character meant danger to order. This logic did not need to be spoken aloud. It was absorbed through repetition, through courts, through military hierarchy, through civic rituals where failure was visible and remembered. Over time, people learned that making mistakes did not simply slow progress, it lowered status. And status in Rome was everything. Once this association took hold, something important changed. People stopped asking whether a rule made sense. They focused on whether they were obeying it well enough. The system no longer needed to justify itself. The individual did. Mistakes stopped being signals. They became verdicts. This is where modern life still echoes Rome most clearly. When something goes wrong today, the first instinct is rarely curiosity. It is self-interrogation. What did I miss? What should I have known? Why wasn't I better prepared, even when the failure was structural, even when the expectations were contradictory, even when success depended on factors no one controlled? The Roman habit remains intact. Failure feels personal before it feels contextual. Rome did not invent accountability, but it redefined it. Accountability was no longer about repairing harm. It became about proving worthiness. To fail was to suggest you had not earned your place. And once a society accepts that belief, mistakes become terrifying. Not because of consequences, but because of what they appear to reveal. People begin to monitor themselves constantly. They rehearse actions. They second-guess instincts. They delay decisions until certainty feels absolute, and certainty rarely arrives. This creates a population that is cautious, obedient, and deeply anxious, while appearing responsible and composed. Rome valued that appearance. A person who feared being wrong was far easier to govern than a person who questioned the rules. Over time, this fear moved inward. You no longer needed a superior to question your competence. You did it yourself. You replayed conversations. You edited your own thoughts before speaking. You framed setbacks as personal shortcomings rather than systemic strain. Not because you were fragile, but because that framing felt expected. Rome taught people that discipline was not just behavior, it was identity. A disciplined person was moral. An undisciplined person was suspect. This is why exhaustion became dangerous. Rest began to look like weakness. If you slowed down, you were not simply tired, you were failing to uphold your role. If you hesitated, you were not careful, you were incompetent. If you questioned instructions, you were not thoughtful, you were disruptive. Rome did not punish curiosity directly. It made curiosity costly, because curiosity risks mistakes, and mistakes risk judgment. So people learned to play safe, to follow precedent, to copy what had worked before, even when it no longer worked, even when it no longer made sense. This mindset survived the empire itself. Centuries later, people still experience mistakes not as information, but as threats to identity. A wrong answer feels humiliating. A misstep feels exposing. An error feels like proof that you never truly belonged. And the most unsettling part is how normal this feels. We say things like, "I messed up," when what we really mean is something didn't work. We apologize for outcomes we didn't control. We internalize responsibility for systems that were never designed for clarity. This is Roman thinking operating quietly. The transformation of error into moral failure also reshaped learning. Learning became risky. If mistakes reveal character, then learning publicly becomes dangerous. You don't want to be seen trying. Trying implies uncertainty, and uncertainty implies weakness. So people prefer appearing competent over becoming competent. They avoid questions, they hide confusion, they nod along even when understanding hasn't arrived. Rome would have recognized this immediately, because a population that fears being wrong will always choose silence over challenge. And silence preserves order. The cost of this logic is subtle but immense. Innovation slows, honesty shrinks, growth becomes performative. People work hard but rarely feel secure. They succeed but never feel finished. They improve constantly but never feel enough. All because mistakes stopped being moments and became mirrors, mirrors that reflect not what happened, but who you supposedly are. Rome did not need to declare people guilty. It trained them to assume guilt automatically. If something failed, you must have failed first. And once that assumption becomes default, the system is protected from scrutiny. Because why examine the structure when the problem is clearly you? This is the quiet genius of Roman moralization. It redirected attention inward. Instead of asking, "Is this rule effective?" people asked, "Why couldn't I follow it better?" Instead of asking, "Is this demand reasonable?" they asked, "Why am I struggling with it?" Over time, entire populations became self-correcting. Not healthier, not freer, just quieter. Rome did not last because it eliminated mistakes. It lasted because it made people afraid of making them. And that fear outlived the empire. Tonight, as we move deeper into this history, remember this. Not every error is a failure. Not every failure is a flaw. And not every flaw belongs to you. But Rome taught the world to forget that distinction. And once forgotten, it is remarkably difficult to remember. Guilt as a management tool. Rome eventually discovered something every lasting system learns. Force is expensive. Surveillance is exhausting. Punishment attracts attention. Guilt does none of these things. Guilt works quietly. It requires no guards, no paperwork, no visible authority. Once guilt is internalized, people manage themselves. Rome did not invent guilt, but it perfected its use. In the Roman mind, guilt was not primarily emotional, it was functional. A guilty person does not demand explanations. They assume the explanation already exists and that they failed to meet it. A guilty person does not ask whether the rule is fair. They ask why they could not follow it better. A guilty person does not challenge authority. They apologize to it. This made guilt the most efficient administrative tool Rome ever developed. If someone feels responsible for their suffering, they will endure almost anything. Rome understood that pressure applied externally produces resistance. Pressure absorbed internally produces compliance. Once guilt takes root, pressure no longer needs to be applied. It sustains itself. A person who feels guilty believes they owe something: effort, obedience, silence. And debt creates discipline. Rome did not need to constantly remind people of consequences. People reminded themselves. They monitored their own thoughts. They corrected their own behavior. They restrained their own desires. Not because they were forced, but because guilt framed restraint as virtue. This was crucial. A population motivated by fear will eventually rebel. A population motivated by guilt will try harder. Rome trained people to believe that discomfort meant responsibility, and responsibility meant moral worth. So suffering stopped being a signal. It became proof. If you were struggling, you must not be disciplined enough. If you were overwhelmed, you must not be organized enough. And if you were angry, you must be immature. Guilt redirected emotion inward. Anger turned into self-criticism. Frustration turned into shame. Doubt turned into silence. And silence is easy to govern. Rome also understood something darker. Guilt does not feel like control. It feels like conscience. When people police themselves, they believe they are being ethical. They believe they are being responsible, that they believe they are doing the right thing. That belief makes guilt almost impossible to resist. You cannot argue with guilt the way you argue with authority, because guilt speaks in your own voice. It sounds like concern, like maturity, like realism. It does not say, "This system is exploiting you." It says, "You should have handled this better." Rome did not need to tell people they were insufficient. It trained them to arrive at that conclusion alone. Over time, guilt became the default explanation for discomfort. If something felt wrong, it must be your fault. If you fell behind, you must not be trying hard enough. If you questioned the arrangement, you must be ungrateful. Rome rarely punished those who complied poorly. It rewarded those who blamed themselves quickly. The faster someone internalized guilt, the less attention they required. This is why guilt is cheaper than force. Force must be applied again and again. Guilt needs only one successful lesson. After that, it repeats automatically. Centuries later, the structure remains intact. Modern systems still rely on guilt far more than punishment. People apologize for delays caused by broken processes. They feel ashamed for burnout caused by overload. They blame themselves for confusion created by complexity. They do not ask why expectations are contradictory. They ask why they cannot meet them. Guilt turns structural pressure into personal failure. And once pressure becomes personal, the system disappears from view. This is not accidental. A system that can be questioned must be defended. A system that induces guilt never needs justification, because guilt reframes suffering as deserved, not explicitly, not cruelly, quietly. You feel behind, so you work harder, you feel inadequate, so you improve yourself, you feel exhausted, so you optimize your rest. At no point do you ask whether the environment itself is unreasonable. Rome would recognize this pattern immediately, because it is exactly how the empire kept order across impossible distances. Governors could not watch everyone. Officials could not manage every interaction. So Rome taught people to manage themselves through moral pressure. Do the right thing. Be disciplined. Fulfill your duty. And if you fail, feel ashamed. That shame will correct you. The brilliance of guilt is that it disguises obedience as integrity. A person who follows rules out of fear knows they are constrained. A person who follows rules out of guilt believes they are choosing correctly. This is why guilt feels noble. It carries the language of responsibility, of maturity, of self-awareness, but underneath it performs the same function as control. It keeps demands unchallenged. Rome did not want people asking whether expectations were humane. It wanted them asking whether they were worthy. Once worthiness becomes the question, everything changes. People tolerate imbalance. They accept overload. They endure contradiction, because failure now reflects character, not circumstance. This is why guilt erodes solidarity. If everyone believes their struggle is personal, no one compares experiences. No one organizes. No one resists. They improve themselves in isolation. Rome did not need unity among the governed. It needed separation. Guilt separated people quietly. Each person carried their own burden privately, assuming it was uniquely theirs. This prevented shared anger. And shared anger is dangerous. Guilt also has another advantage. It does not end. Punishment has a conclusion. A fine is paid. A sentence is served. Guilt lingers. It follows you into rest, into sleep, into moments of stillness. You can stop working, but guilt keeps watching. Rome did not need to monitor productivity. It taught people to feel uneasy when they were not producing. That unease survives perfectly in modern life. People feel restless when doing nothing, uneasy when resting without justification, suspicious of their own comfort. This is not ambition, it is conditioning. Guilt ensures that pressure never turns off. It becomes internalized management. And the most unsettling part is how often this is praised. We call it responsibility. We call it discipline. We call it adulthood. Rarely do we call it what it is: a tool, a cheap one, a quiet one, a remarkably effective one. Rome did not collapse because it lost control. It collapsed because it no longer needed to maintain it. By the time the empire faded, its most important work was already complete. People had learned to govern themselves through guilt. And once guilt becomes moral identity, management becomes invisible. Tonight, remember this: guilt does not prove virtue. It proves training. And once you recognize the training, you begin to see how much pressure you were never meant to carry alone. The internal prosecutor. Rome did not need prosecutors everywhere. That would have been inefficient. Courts require buildings. Officials require salaries. Enforcement requires effort. Rome chose something far more durable. It placed the prosecutor inside the individual. Not a man in a robe, not a voice from authority, but a presence that sounds suspiciously like your own thoughts. A voice that does not shout. It questions. Why wasn't this done better? Why didn't you anticipate the problem? Why are you struggling with something that seems easy for everyone else? This voice does not accuse loudly. It interrogates quietly. And that is why it works. The internal prosecutor does not feel imposed. It feels reasonable. It presents itself as responsibility, as self-awareness, as maturity. Rome understood that external judgment creates resistance. Internal judgment creates obedience. Once people learn to question themselves automatically, authority becomes unnecessary. You begin to examine your own intentions. You doubt your instincts before acting on them. You search for personal fault before considering context. This habit does not emerge naturally. Children do not instinctively assume they are inadequate. They test. They experiment. They fail without moral interpretation. The internal prosecutor is taught. Rome trained people to believe that every outcome required explanation, and that the most plausible explanation was personal deficiency. If something went wrong, someone must be responsible. And if no one else was clearly at fault, the responsibility quietly settled inward. Over time, this habit hardened into reflex. You no longer asked whether expectations were realistic. You asked why you could not meet them. You no longer asked whether the instructions were clear. You assumed you had missed something. You no longer trusted your discomfort. You treated it as evidence against yourself. The internal prosecutor is relentless because it never sleeps. It reviews conversations long after they end. It rewrites memories with harsher language. It reframes uncertainty as incompetence. And unlike an external judge, it offers no acquittal. There is always something you could have done better. Always a tone you should have adjusted. Always an effort you could have increased. Rome did not need to threaten people. It taught them to live as if they were constantly being evaluated. This is why self-doubt often feels productive. It masquerades as improvement. The internal prosecutor convinces you that criticism is care, that pressure is preparation, that self-suspicion is wisdom. But suspicion directed inward rarely leads to clarity. It leads to hesitation. People begin to delay decisions, waiting for certainty that never arrives. They soften opinions to avoid being wrong. They rehearse explanations before acting as if justification is required in advance. This does not create thoughtful citizens. It creates cautious ones. Rome preferred caution. A cautious person does not challenge hierarchy. They question themselves instead. The internal prosecutor also rewrites motivation. Joy becomes suspect. Rest becomes indulgent. Confidence becomes arrogance. Before allowing yourself satisfaction, the prosecutor asks whether it is deserved. Before celebrating success, it asks whether it will last. Before trusting your judgment, it asks whether you are qualified. This constant questioning does not feel like oppression. It feels like discipline. And discipline was Rome's favorite virtue. A disciplined citizen was predictable. Predictability was stability. Stability was survival. So Rome rewarded self-surveillance. People who monitored themselves closely were praised as responsible. Those who questioned less were trusted more. Over time, external evaluation faded. Internal evaluation intensified. You learned to anticipate criticism before it arrived, to adjust behavior preemptively, to silence thoughts that might cause trouble. This is how obedience becomes self-expression. The internal prosecutor also isolates, because if failure is always personal, there is no reason to compare experiences. You assume others are coping better. You assume their silence means competence. So you struggle privately, believing your difficulty is unique. This prevents solidarity. Rome did not need people sharing frustration. It needed them internalizing it. The prosecutor also ensures that anger never reaches the system. When something feels unjust, the voice intervenes. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you should be grateful. Anger dissolves into self-correction. Rome understood that anger directed outward is dangerous. Anger redirected inward is useful. It becomes self-discipline. The most unsettling aspect of the internal prosecutor is how moral it sounds. It does not say you are controlled. It says you should do better. It does not say this demand is unreasonable. It says others manage it. It does not say the system failed. It says you did. Because the voice uses your own language, it feels trustworthy. You rarely question it, you obey it. And because it never appears as force, you rarely recognize it as power. Rome did not need to maintain surveillance. It trained people to observe themselves. This habit survived every political change. Empires fell, kings disappeared, institutions shifted, but the internal prosecutor remained. It adapted easily to modern life. Now it speaks in the language of productivity, self-optimization, personal responsibility. It tells you to improve yourself endlessly, to refine weaknesses, to correct flaws. It promises relief once you become enough. But enough is never defined. That ambiguity keeps the prosecutor employed. If there is always room for improvement, there is always room for judgment. This creates a strange paradox. People work harder than ever, yet feel perpetually inadequate. They achieve more, yet trust themselves less. They are free, yet feel constantly evaluated, not by society, by themselves. Rome's most enduring court does not require attendance. It follows you everywhere. It sits quietly during moments of rest. It comments during moments of joy. It questions during moments of confidence. And because it never announces itself as authority, it is rarely resisted. This is why recognizing the internal prosecutor matters. Not to silence self-reflection, not to reject responsibility, but to distinguish between growth and surveillance, between learning and self-punishment, between discipline chosen and discipline inherited. The voice inside you did not emerge by accident. It was trained by centuries of moralized error, by guilt framed as virtue, by systems that survived, by making people doubt themselves first. Rome no longer rules cities, but it still runs trials, quiet ones, personal ones, endless ones. And until the prosecutor is recognized, the verdict will always feel the same. Not guilty enough to stop, never innocent enough to rest. Why you feel guilty for things you didn't cause? As systems grow more complex, something strange happens. Responsibility becomes harder to locate, but guilt does not disappear, it simply moves. Rome understood this long before complexity had a name. An empire is too large for accountability to flow cleanly. Too many offices, too many layers, too many decisions made far from their consequences. So Rome made a choice. Instead of tracing failure upward through the structure, it trained people to absorb it downward. If something broke, someone must have failed. And if the cause could not be clearly identified, the safest place for blame was the individual closest to the problem. Over time, this became a rule so quiet it felt natural. If everything is not working, it must be your fault, not the system, not the design, not the contradiction built into the rules themselves. You. This lesson did not need enforcement. It repeated itself. People learned to feel guilty for delays they did not control, for outcomes they could not influence, for confusion produced by instructions that were never clear. And because the system was vast and abstract, it was easier to blame oneself than to confront something shapeless. Rome understood the psychology perfectly. A person can argue with a ruler. They cannot argue with a structure they cannot see. So Rome allowed systems to grow dense and distant, while training individuals to remain emotionally accountable. If a tax was unjust, you must not have prepared correctly. If a process failed, you must not have followed it closely enough. If an order made no sense, you must have misunderstood it. Over time, guilt replaced analysis. People stopped asking how things worked and started asking what they had done wrong. This inversion was not accidental. A system that absorbs blame must defend itself. A system that exports blame becomes untouchable. Once individuals habitually take responsibility for structural failures, the structure itself fades into the background. It becomes inevitable, natural, beyond question. Rome did not need to declare its systems perfect. It simply made questioning them feel inappropriate. After all, why criticize the arrangement when the problem is clearly your performance? This mindset survived intact. Modern life is filled with systems so complex that no single person understands them fully. Bureaucracies, markets, technologies, institutions that operate across distances and abstractions. When they fail, there is rarely a clear villain. So guilt settles where it always has, on the individual. You feel guilty for being overwhelmed by workloads designed to exceed capacity. You feel guilty for missing deadlines created by conflicting demands. You feel guilty for burnout caused by constant pressure. At no point are you invited to ask whether the system itself is humane, because guilt keeps that question silent. Rome understood that complexity is a shield. The more complicated a system becomes, the easier it is to claim that failure is due to misuse rather than design. If something goes wrong, the system did not fail. It was applied incorrectly. And if it was applied incorrectly, someone must be responsible. That someone is rarely the architect. It is the person at the end of the chain, the one who tried to make it work. Over time, people learned to carry failures that did not belong to them. They apologized for structural delays. They internalized contradictions. They blamed themselves for outcomes that were mathematically unavoidable. This produced a strange emotional economy. The system remained neutral, cold, unfeeling. The individual remained anxious, apologetic, and exhausted. Rome did not need to punish people for systemic failure. People punished themselves. This self-punishment was framed as maturity, taking responsibility, being professional, owning mistakes. But there is a difference between responsibility and absorption. Responsibility involves power. Absorption involves silence. You cannot correct what you are not allowed to name. When guilt replaces analysis, learning stops. Instead of asking why a process failed, people focus on how to endure it better. They adapt to dysfunction rather than questioning it. This is why complex systems often feel impossible to challenge. Not because they are perfect, but because they are emotionally insulated. Anyone who questions them appears unreasonable. After all, everyone else seems to be coping, but that appearance is deceptive. Each person believes they are uniquely failing because guilt is experienced privately. No one compares notes. No one sees the pattern. Rome relied on this isolation. If people recognized that everyone felt the same strain, they might conclude the structure was flawed. So guilt ensured that strain felt personal. And personal strain does not produce collective action. It produces self-improvement plans. Rome did not fear people improving themselves. It encouraged it. Self-improvement absorbs energy that might otherwise be directed outward. People become busy fixing themselves, while the structure remains untouched. This is why guilt is such an effective management tool. It converts structural pressure into personal motivation. You do not ask for relief. You ask how to become stronger. You do not question demands. You question your capacity. You do not resist. You adapt. And adaptation feels virtuous. Rome praised endurance. It admired those who bore weight quietly. The ideal citizen did not complain about the burden. They carried it, even when the burden was unnecessary, even when it was cruel, even when it served no purpose beyond maintaining order. This ethic still shapes modern expectations. People are admired for handling impossible workloads, for functioning under constant strain, for surviving without complaint. The system does not change. The individual is praised for enduring it, and guilt ensures that endurance feels mandatory. If you struggle, you feel you are failing. If you succeed, you feel you must maintain it forever. There is no moment where the system is held accountable. Rome understood that once people accept guilt for things they did not cause, the system no longer needs legitimacy. It only needs continuity, and continuity is achieved when failure is personalized. This is why systemic critique often feels taboo. It sounds like excuse-making, like weakness, like irresponsibility. Rome trained people to equate criticism of structure with avoidance of duty. So when someone says, "This system is broken," the internal response is suspicion. Are they lazy? Unmotivated? Looking for shortcuts? The possibility that the system itself is harmful rarely enters the conversation because guilt has already closed it. This is not because people are incapable of critical thought. It is because they have been trained to direct that thought inward. Rome did not erase intelligence. It redirected it. People became experts at analyzing themselves instead of analyzing power. And that redirection is why so many feel exhausted, without being able to explain why. They are carrying weight that does not belong to them. Weight generated by design, choices, incentives, and structures they did not create and cannot easily change. But guilt convinces them that the weight is a test of character, so they carry it quietly, persistently, individually, until exhaustion feels like a personal flaw rather than a predictable outcome. Rome's greatest protection was not its armies. It was this habit, the habit of blaming oneself for systemic failure. Once that habit takes hold, systems become untouchable. Not because they are just, but because no one feels entitled to question them. Tonight, remember this. Feeling guilty does not mean you are responsible, and responsibility does not always belong where guilt lands. Rome taught the world to confuse the two, and that confusion still protects systems long after empires fall. Self-discipline that never turns off. At some point, discipline stopped being something you did. It became something you were. In the Roman world, discipline began as action. Show up, follow orders, maintain formation, fulfill duty. But Rome did not stop there. It discovered that discipline was far more effective when it no longer required instruction. So discipline moved inward. It became a mental posture, a constant readiness, a state of vigilance that did not depend on circumstance. You were not disciplined only when working. You were disciplined while resting, while eating, while thinking, especially while thinking. Rome praised this as order. Order meant predictability. Predictability meant stability, and stability mattered more than comfort. Once discipline became internal, it no longer turned off. You could stop moving, but the expectation continued. You could sit still, but your mind remained alert, scanning for what should be done next. Rest was permitted, but only briefly, only conditionally, only with justification. If you rested too long, something felt wrong, not externally, internally. A quiet tension, a low hum of unease. Rome understood this sensation well. It was the feeling of unused capacity. In Roman thought, unused capacity was suspicious. A citizen who was not occupied might begin to think. A soldier without orders might question them. An idle population was dangerous. So Rome moralized activity. To be busy was to be virtuous. To be still was to risk decay. This belief seeped into the body. Over time, people learned to associate rest, not with recovery, but with failure. If you were tired, you must not have managed yourself properly. If you needed a pause, you must have miscalculated. If you stopped, you were falling behind. This is how discipline becomes perpetual. You no longer need external pressure to stay active. You generate it yourself. You monitor your energy. You optimize your time. You evaluate your productivity even during moments meant for relief. Rome did not need to demand this. It taught people to feel uneasy when they were not contributing. That unease survived the empire. Today, people rest with guilt. They take breaks while planning their return. They relax while thinking about what remains unfinished. They sleep while calculating how early they must wake. The body pauses. The mind does not. This is not ambition. It is conditioning. Rome called this discipline. Modern life calls it responsibility. But responsibility without limits becomes surveillance. And when surveillance is internal, there is no refuge. Self-discipline that never turns off creates a strange paradox. People appear controlled, yet feel exhausted. They appear productive, yet feel behind. They appear free, yet feel constantly evaluated, not by others, by themselves. Rome understood that constant readiness created compliant citizens. A person always prepared for duty rarely questions the necessity of that duty. If discipline is continuous, pause becomes suspicious. You start to explain your rest. I just needed to recharge. I'll make it up later. I earned this. Rest is no longer a right, it is a reward. And rewards can be revoked. This mindset trains people to treat their own limits as negotiable. Fatigue becomes a challenge to overcome. Burnout becomes a personal failure. Exhaustion becomes something to manage rather than address. Rome admired endurance. A citizen who endured quietly was valuable. A citizen who complained disrupted order. So endurance became a moral trait. The longer you could function under strain, the more disciplined you appeared, even if the strain was unnecessary. even if it caused harm, even if it served no purpose beyond maintaining rhythm. Self-discipline without rest does not create strength, it creates numbness. But numbness looks like control, and control was Rome's ideal. This is why people today struggle to stop. Not because they love work, but because stopping feels unsafe. Silence feels empty. Stillness feels exposed. When discipline never turns off, rest becomes a confrontation. Without tasks, the mind has nothing to focus on but itself. And Rome trained people to distrust that space. Idle time invites reflection. Reflection invites doubt. Doubt invites challenge. So discipline fills the silence. Schedules, metrics, goals, anything to keep movement continuous. Rome did not need chains. It needed momentum. And momentum is easiest to maintain. When people fear stopping, this fear does not announce itself as fear. It sounds like responsibility, like adulthood, like realism. It says, I should be doing something, even when there is nothing that needs to be done. This voice is not natural. Children do not feel guilty for resting. They stop when tired. They resume when ready. The guilt arrives later. It is learned. Rome taught people that discipline was proof of worth. So discipline became identity. You were not disciplined sometimes. You were disciplined always. And if discipline faltered, so did self-respect. This is why modern people struggle to enjoy success. Achievement does not bring relief. It raises the baseline. Once you prove you can handle more, more is expected. Self-discipline adjusts upward indefinitely. There is no finish line, only maintenance. Rome did not design discipline to end. It designed it to persist. Even as empires fell, this internal posture remained useful. It adapted easily to new systems, factories, corporations, institutions. Anywhere continuous output was valued, discipline without rest thrived. People learned to measure their days by productivity rather than experience. A day was good if something was accomplished. A day was wasted if it was not. Joy became secondary. Presence became optional. Rome would have approved, because a person who measures life this way rarely asks what the effort is for. They are too busy maintaining pace. The cost of this never-ending discipline is subtle. People lose sensitivity to their own signals. Hunger, fatigue, boredom, grief, all become interruptions to be managed, rather than information to be listened to. Rome did not want citizens listening inwardly. It wanted them aligned outwardly, and self-discipline ensured alignment even in solitude. You follow rules when no one is watching. You push yourself when no one asks. You judge yourself when no one speaks. This is not freedom misused. It is training completed. Rome's greatest achievement was not teaching people how to work. It was teaching them how to never stop working inside their own minds. Tonight, notice this carefully. If rest makes you uneasy, if stillness feels undeserved, if stopping feels irresponsible, that discomfort is not evidence of virtue. It is evidence of conditioning. Discipline is a tool, not a permanent state. When it never turns off, it stops serving you. Rome called this order. But order without rest is not stability. It is quiet exhaustion. And exhaustion is the final cost of discipline that forgot how to end. The confession without relief. Rome believed in confession, but not the kind that frees you. Confession in the Roman sense was never meant to erase the weight. It was meant to locate it, to name the error, to acknowledge it, to record it, and then to carry it forward. This is an important distinction. In many traditions, confession exists to end something. A burden is spoken so it can be released. A fault is named so it can be forgiven. A past is acknowledged so it can be left behind. Rome had no interest in endings. Rome preferred continuity. So, confession became a tool not of relief, but of memory. You did not confess in order to be free. You confessed in order to be known. And once known, you could be measured. Rome understood that guilt is most effective when it does not resolve. If guilt ends, pressure disappears. If guilt lingers, discipline remains. So confession was structured not to cleanse, but to document. You admitted fault. The fault was noted. And life continued with the fault intact. There was no clean slate, only a record. This created a very specific psychological outcome. People learned to see mistakes not as moments, but as identities. What you did wrong stayed attached to who you were. Confession did not remove the stain. It defined it, and once defined, it could be managed. Rome was not interested in absolution. Absolution closes a case. Rome wanted cases to remain open. Because an open case keeps people careful. When guilt does not end, people regulate themselves endlessly. They remember their errors long after consequences have passed. They adjust behavior not out of understanding, but out of fear of repetition. They live cautiously, always aware of what they have already admitted. This is how confession becomes control. Not through punishment, but through self-surveillance. Rome taught people to speak their own failures out loud so they would never forget them. And forgetting was dangerous. A person who forgets guilt might relax. A person who relaxes might question. A person who questions might resist. So guilt was preserved, not aggressively, not cruelly, administratively. This logic survived perfectly into modern systems. Today, people are encouraged to confess constantly. They confess mistakes in performance reviews. They confess weaknesses in interviews. They confess shortcomings in self-improvement culture. The language has changed, but the function has not. You are invited to admit where you fall short, not so you can be released, but so the record can be updated. Your flaws become data, and data does not forgive. Data accumulates. You are told this is healthy, that acknowledging faults is maturity, that self-criticism is honesty. But notice what is missing: relief. After confession, you are not lighter. You are more aware, more cautious, more careful, more controlled. Rome would recognize this immediately. because confession without forgiveness does not heal. It trains. A person who carries confessed guilt does not need to be monitored. They already know what they did wrong. They already remember it. They already fear repeating it. This makes them predictable. Rome valued predictability above all else. Predictable citizens do not surprise authority. They adjust themselves in advance. Confession also creates hierarchy. The one who listens holds power. The one who confesses lowers themselves. Even when no punishment follows, the imbalance remains. Rome understood that power does not need to act if it is acknowledged. Once someone admits fault, they have already submitted. The act of confession itself becomes compliance. This is why confession without relief is so effective. It produces obedience without force. You are not punished. You are recorded, and being recorded changes behavior permanently. The modern version of this is subtle. People confess inefficiency. They confess burnout. They confess lack of motivation. And instead of being relieved, they are offered techniques, time management, mindset shifts, productivity frameworks. The message is clear. The problem has been acknowledged. Now manage it better. There is no moment where the pressure is lifted, only moments where it is reorganized. Rome did not want people free from error. It wanted people aware of it. Awareness without forgiveness keeps people tense, always adjusting, always monitoring, always careful. This creates a population that appears responsible, but feels permanently inadequate. Confession becomes a loop. You admit fault. You promise improvement. You fall short again. You confess again. The cycle never ends, because the system was never designed to end it. Rome did not need people to be perfect. It needed them to be manageable. Confession without relief ensures manageability, because a person who believes they are always slightly wrong will never fully trust themselves. They will defer. They will hesitate. They will seek approval. And approval keeps authority intact. What makes this system unsettling is how moral it appears. Confession sounds virtuous. It sounds honest. It sounds humble. But humility without mercy becomes self-punishment. Rome blurred that line deliberately. People learned to mistake self-criticism for character. The more you admitted fault, the more responsible you appeared. The more responsible you appeared, the more weight you were given. And the more weight you carried, the more guilt you accumulated. Confession fed itself. Rome did not offer forgiveness, because forgiveness interrupts control. A forgiven person can start again. A recorded person cannot. This is why modern people often feel trapped by their own honesty. They speak openly about struggles, but feel no lighter afterward. They name burnout, but return to the same conditions. They acknowledge limits, but are still expected to exceed them. The confession happened. The system noted it. Nothing else changed. This is not failure of sincerity. It is success of design. Rome taught the world that confession could exist without release. That naming pain was enough. It is not. Naming without mercy is not healing. it is administration. Rome perfected that logic, and it lives on wherever people are encouraged to expose themselves without being freed. Tonight, understand this carefully. If admitting your struggles does not relieve them, if honesty increases pressure rather than easing it, if confession leaves you feeling more responsible instead of less, that is not because you confessed incorrectly. It is because the system was never meant to forgive. Rome did not want absolution. It wanted memory. And memory, once internalized, is one of the most powerful forms of control ever created. When self-criticism replaces resistance. At a certain point, resistance stopped moving outward. It turned inward. Instead of questioning the system, people began questioning themselves. Instead of asking why conditions were unreasonable, they asked why they were struggling to adapt. Rome did not suppress rebellion only through force. It found a quieter solution. If people could be taught to fight themselves, they would never need to fight authority. Self-criticism became a substitute for resistance. This shift was subtle. It did not look like surrender. It looked like responsibility. People were encouraged to improve, to refine, to correct. And improvement sounds virtuous. But notice what improvement replaced: not injustice, not exploitation, not imbalance. It replaced questioning. When systems became heavy but people did not push back, they leaned inward. They optimized habits. They adjusted attitudes. They blamed motivation. The pressure remained untouched. Rome admired this arrangement. A population focused on self-improvement has little energy left for systemic critique. Energy is finite. If it is consumed internally, it never reaches outward. Rome understood that resistance requires clarity, and clarity requires comparison. You must see that something is wrong, not only for you, but for others as well. Self-criticism prevents that comparison. If your struggle feels personal, you assume others are coping. You assume the fault is yours. So you work harder, you refine routines, you read manuals, you adopt frameworks, you do everything except ask whether the conditions themselves are unreasonable. Rome did not need to silence dissent. It redirected it. Anger turned into self-discipline. Frustration turned into self-analysis. Exhaustion turned into self-optimization. Each emotion that might have fueled resistance was converted into personal responsibility. This conversion felt productive. After all, you were doing something. Improving yourself feels active. Resisting a system feels risky. Rome preferred activity that stayed contained. Self-criticism also feels safer. If the problem is you, then the solution is within reach. You can fix yourself. If the problem is the system, the solution is uncertain. It requires others. It requires conflict. It requires visibility. Self-criticism offers the illusion of control. Rome understood this psychological comfort. People prefer solvable problems, even if those problems are misidentified. It is easier to believe you are insufficient than to believe you are trapped in a structure designed without regard for human limits. So people chose the explanation that preserved order. They improved themselves inside conditions that never improved. Rome did not fear self-improvement. It encouraged it. A citizen who constantly refines themselves rarely asks why refinement is endlessly required. A person who believes they are always behind will never question the pace. Self-criticism also fragments collective awareness. When everyone assumes their struggle is unique, solidarity dissolves. No one compares experiences. No one notices patterns. Each person works alone on what they believe is a personal flaw. Rome thrived on this isolation. Resistance requires shared recognition. Self-criticism keeps recognition private. This is why modern systems celebrate self-help. Not because growth is harmful, but because growth directed inward is politically quiet. People attend workshops instead of organizing. They optimize sleep instead of demanding rest. They meditate through pressure rather than challenging it. Rome would have admired the efficiency. Self-criticism also creates obedience without resentment. A person who feels oppressed may resist. A person who feels inadequate tries harder. Rome preferred the second. If you believe failure reflects character, you will not blame the structure. You will correct yourself. This keeps authority clean. Rome did not want citizens asking whether expectations were humane. It wanted them asking whether they were strong enough. That question never ends. Self-criticism has no finish line. You can always be more disciplined, more focused, more resilient. There is no moment where you are enough. And because there is no end, pressure continues indefinitely. This is how resistance disappears quietly, not crushed, not forbidden, replaced by self-monitoring, by self-correction, by self-doubt, framed as maturity. Rome understood that a self-critical population polices itself. It does not need orders. It anticipates them. It does not need punishment. It punishes itself. It does not need censorship. It edits itself. This is not because people are weak. It is because the model rewards this behavior. People who blame themselves are praised as accountable. People who question systems are labeled difficult. Over time, the message becomes clear. Improve yourself. Do not disturb the structure. Rome did not collapse resistance through violence alone. It eroded the idea that resistance was appropriate. If something is wrong, the mature response is self-adjustment. Anything else looks irresponsible. This logic still governs modern life. When workloads increase, people attend productivity seminars. When burnout spreads, people are told to manage stress. When instability grows, people are encouraged to build resilience. No one asks why instability is constant. Rome would recognize this pattern instantly because it ensures that energy circulates inward. Self-criticism also creates loyalty. If you have invested years improving yourself, to survive a system, admitting that the system is flawed would mean admitting that effort was misdirected. That is painful. So people defend the conditions. That exhausted them, that they justify the system because they adapted to it. Rome relied on this psychological investment. Once people commit to self-correction, they become stakeholders in the structure. Critiquing it feels like undermining their own identity. So resistance fades. not because people agree with the system, but because they are entangled in it. Self-criticism becomes a habit. You examine tone, you soften reactions, you reinterpret discomfort. And each time you do, you move further away from resistance. Rome did not need to eliminate rebellion. It made rebellion feel immature. Self-improvement sounded wiser, more adult, more responsible, and responsibility became the language of compliance. This is why resistance today often feels embarrassing. Anger feels unsophisticated. Protest feels excessive. Self-criticism feels refined. Rome trained people to prefer refinement over disruption. But refinement does not change conditions, and it adapts to them. And adaptation, when endless, it becomes endurance. Endurance looks admirable, but it carries a cost. The cost is that nothing improves. People become better at surviving, while systems become better at demanding survival. Rome loved this model because it produced stability without requiring justice, order without reform, silence without force. Tonight, recognize this clearly. If your first response to difficulty is to ask how to improve yourself, pause. That instinct did not emerge naturally. It was trained. Self-criticism is not always insight. It is often redirected resistance. And once you see that redirection, you can choose, not necessarily to rebel, not necessarily to confront, but to stop fighting yourself for conditions you did not create. Rome thrived when people turned inward. Clarity begins when they stop. The strange comfort of blame. There is a reason blame feels comforting. Even when it hurts, even when it exhausts, even when it turns inward. Blame offers something powerful: control. If the problem is you, then the solution is also you. You can adjust, you can improve, you can fix. Rome understood this instinct deeply. A world shaped by large systems is frightening. Too many moving parts. Too many invisible forces. Too many outcomes that do not respond to effort. Blame simplifies that chaos. It collapses complexity into a single manageable point: the self. Rome did not need people to feel happy. It needed them to feel oriented. Self-blame provides orientation. It tells you where to stand. It tells you where to direct effort. It tells you what to correct. Even when the conclusion is wrong, the clarity is soothing. If the fault is yours, then the world still makes sense. This is why self-blame persists, even when it causes pain. It is less frightening than helplessness. Rome learned that people will accept almost any burden if they believe the burden is meaningful. Self-blame gives suffering meaning. You are not struggling because the system is unstable. You are struggling because you have not mastered it yet. That explanation hurts, but it also promises redemption. Work harder, become better, and the suffering will end. Or so it seems. This promise keeps people moving. Rome depended on movement. A population that keeps moving does not stop to examine the road. Self-blame keeps momentum alive. If exhaustion arrives, it is interpreted as a test. If failure occurs, it is framed as instruction. Everything becomes useful, even pain. Rome valued this transformation. Pain that does not provoke resistance is ideal. Pain that motivates self-correction is even better. This is why blame feels strangely stabilizing. It turns disorder into a lesson. It turns injustice into motivation. It turns harm into homework. And homework feels solvable. The alternative is far more unsettling. If the system itself is flawed, then effort may not matter. If outcomes are disconnected from intention, then improvement offers no guarantee. If suffering is structural, then it cannot be fixed by will alone. That uncertainty is difficult to live with. Rome understood that most people prefer false clarity to honest ambiguity. Self-blame offers clarity. It draws a clean line between cause and effect. You failed because you were insufficient. You struggled because you were unprepared. You suffered because you made mistakes. This story is simple, and simplicity is comforting, even when it is cruel. Rome did not need to convince people that the story was true. It only needed to make it plausible. Once plausible, people filled in the rest themselves. They blamed tone, they blamed attitude, they blamed discipline. They rarely blamed design. This habit survives perfectly in modern life. When processes fail, people assume they misunderstood. When workloads overwhelm, people assume they mismanaged time. When systems contradict themselves, people assume personal error. The discomfort is internalized. And internal discomfort feels controllable. You cannot redesign a system alone, but you can criticize yourself endlessly. That criticism gives the illusion of agency. Rome recognized this as psychological efficiency. People who feel in control rarely revolt, even if the control is imaginary. Self-blame also protects hope. If the problem is you, then hope remains intact. You can still imagine a future where you are better, stronger, smarter, more disciplined. That imagined future softens the present. Rome allowed people to hope in this way because the hope kept them compliant. A person waiting to become enough will tolerate conditions indefinitely. The tragedy is that enough never arrives because the conditions never change. The illusion of control sustains endurance. People endure not because things improve, but because they believe improvement is possible through self-correction. Rome admired endurance. It built systems that required it. Self-blame ensured that endurance did not turn into protest. If someone collapses, they blame their limits. If someone fails, that they blame their effort. The system remains untouched. This is the strange comfort of blame. It hurts, but it feels purposeful. It gives suffering a narrative, and narratives help people survive. But survival is not the same as freedom. Rome did not need people free. It needed them functioning. Self-blame also reduces fear. A chaotic world is terrifying. A world where everything happens for a reason, even a harsh one, feels safer If suffering is deserved, then it is predictable. If failure has a cause, then it can be avoided next time. Randomness is disturbing. Structure is reassuring. Self-blame creates structure. It explains why things hurt, even if the explanation is wrong. Rome trained people to prefer explanation over accuracy. An explanation that preserves order is more valuable than truth. That invites disruption. This is why people cling to self-blame. It preserves a sense of coherence. It allows people to believe. That effort still governs outcome. That belief is powerful and dangerous because it prevents people from seeing when effort is being exploited. Rome did not deny hardship. It reframed it. Hardship became proof of commitment. Struggle became evidence of virtue. Failure became motivation. Blame turned pain into fuel. But fuel burns. Over time, people become tired. They work harder and yet feel less capable. They improve constantly, yet never feel secure. They blame themselves for this fatigue. They assume they are doing something wrong, and they rarely ask whether the system is designed to exhaust. Rome relied on this misdirection. Exhausted people are easier to govern when they believe exhaustion is their own fault. Self-blame also isolates. Each person carries their burden privately. No one compares notes. Everyone believes they are uniquely failing. This prevents shared recognition. And without shared recognition, there is no collective response. Rome did not fear individuals blaming themselves. It depended on it. Because once blame is internalized, power no longer needs to defend itself. It becomes invisible. The system fades into the background. Only the self remains under scrutiny. This is the final comfort of blame. It gives you something to focus on, while the true source of pressure remains unnamed. Tonight, recognize this gently. If blaming yourself feels stabilizing, if it makes suffering feel explainable, if it gives you something to work on, pause. That comfort did not arise by accident. It was trained. Blame does not always mean responsibility. It often means misdirection. Rome taught the world that it was better to feel wrong than to feel powerless. But there is another option. You can recognize complexity without surrendering agency. You can acknowledge limits without condemning yourself. You can endure without believing the endurance is deserved. The comfort of blame is real, but it comes at a cost. It keeps systems intact by keeping scrutiny turned inward. And once you see that comfort clearly, you can decide whether it is still worth paying for. The cost of living on trial, a life lived on trial, does not announce itself. There are no gavels, no raised voices, no formal sentences. There is only evaluation, constant, silent, uninterrupted. Rome did not need to convict people publicly. It taught them to live as if conviction were always possible. And that changes everything. When life feels like a trial, rest becomes suspicious. If you are not actively justifying yourself, you feel exposed. Stillness no longer feels neutral. It feels like negligence. You begin to believe that innocence must be proven again and again through effort. But proof is never final because the rules are not fixed. The standards shift, the expectations expand, the criteria remain vague, and vague criteria ensure permanent uncertainty. Rome understood this perfectly. A clear verdict ends tension. An unclear one sustains it. So Rome created conditions where judgment was implied, but never resolved. You are not declared guilty. You are simply never declared innocent. This is the quiet cost. When innocence is unavailable, people work endlessly to earn it. They produce, they comply, they improve, but nothing closes the case. Each success raises the threshold. Each failure reopens doubt. You live under review. And living under review changes the nervous system. Your body learns vigilance. Your mind learns rehearsal. You anticipate criticism before it arrives. You prepare defenses for questions no one has asked. You adjust behavior to avoid potential fault. This anticipation never turns off. Rome did not need to apply pressure. It trained people to generate it internally. A life on trial has no true rest. Even sleep is partial. The body lies down, but the mind continues working, replaying conversations, rewriting decisions,
Evaluating tone.
There is always something to reconsider, always something that might have been done better. This does not look like tyranny. It looks like responsibility, and that is why it lasts. Rome transformed responsibility into a permanent state. You are not responsible for something. You are responsible as something. A responsible person is always alert, always correcting, always aware of how they might be judged. This posture becomes identity. You are no longer someone who sometimes fails. You are someone who must constantly avoid failure. And avoidance is exhausting. A life on trial also eliminates forgiveness. Forgiveness requires closure. Closure requires an ending, but a system that survives on vigilance cannot afford endings, so mistakes linger. They are remembered, cataloged, revisited. Not always consciously, but they shape future behavior. You become cautious not because you understand consequences, but because you remember shame. Rome did not rely on punishment. It relied on memory. Memory of embarrassment. Memory of error. Memory of falling short. These memories do not fade. They accumulate. And accumulation creates weight. Over time, people stop taking risks. They stop speaking freely. They stop acting intuitively. They stop trusting themselves, not because they lack ability, but because the cost of being wrong feels too high. A life on trial also removes the concept of innocence. Children are innocent because they are not yet accountable. But Rome extended accountability indefinitely. Even exhaustion becomes suspect. If you are tired, you must explain why. If you are overwhelmed, you must justify it. If you are unhappy, you must locate the personal flaw responsible. There is no condition where you are simply allowed to be. Everything must be accounted for. Rome did not want people comfortable. It wanted them legible. Legible people are predictable. Predictable people are manageable. Living on trial makes people legible to themselves. They categorize emotions. They label weaknesses. They track performance. They turn inward constantly, measuring, evaluating, correcting. This inward turn feels introspective, but it is not reflective. Reflection leads to understanding. Evaluation leads to control. Rome preferred control. This is why a life on trial feels serious but empty, busy but unsatisfying. You are always doing something, but never arriving anywhere. Because arrival implies completion, and completion implies release. Rome did not offer release, it offered continuity. The trial continues because the system depends on it. A person who feels perpetually judged will always try harder. They will not pause long enough to ask what the effort is for. They will not stop long enough to notice that the rules keep changing. They will not rest long enough to feel how unnatural the vigilance has become. This is the final cost, not exhaustion alone, but alienation from oneself. When you live on trial, your inner life becomes hostile territory. Thoughts are filtered, emotions are evaluated, desires are questioned. Nothing is allowed to simply exist. Everything must justify itself. Rome did not need to sentence people. It taught them to sentence themselves daily, quietly, without appeal. And because the judge lives inside, there is no escape. Not in success, not in achievement, not even in compliance. Because compliance only raises expectations. This is why people who do everything right often feel the most pressure. They know how fragile approval is. They know how quickly the trial can turn. So they remain alert, always. Rome called this order, but order without rest is not stability, it is permanent tension. A society can survive on that tension. A person cannot. Living on trial drains joy. It drains spontaneity. It drains trust. It drains peace. It replaces them with vigilance. And vigilance feels necessary until you realize it never ends. Rome's most enduring court has no doors, no closing hours, no final verdict. Just a quiet assumption that you must always be proving something. Tonight, let this settle gently. If you feel tired without knowing why, if rest feels undeserved, if satisfaction feels temporary, that is not because you failed. It is because you have been living inside a trial that was never meant to conclude. Rome did not need to condemn you. It taught you how to do it yourself. And the cost of that lesson has been paid every single day. You deserve a verdict of not guilty. Not every exhaustion is a crime. Not every delay is a failure. Not every pain is something that must be corrected. Some things do not need to be fixed. They need to be understood. Rome taught the world to confuse endurance with virtue. It taught people to believe that if something hurt, it must be deserved. If something felt heavy, it must be earned. If something did not work, someone must be at fault. And when no one else could be clearly blamed, the fault quietly moved inward. By now, you may recognize the pattern: the constant evaluation, the internal prosecutor, the guilt that never resolves, the discipline that never turns off, the strange comfort of blame, the life lived under review. None of this means you are broken. It means you were trained. Rome did not last because it eliminated human weakness. It lasted because it taught people to interpret weakness as personal failure rather than structural strain. Once that lesson is absorbed, people stop asking the most important questions. Is this demand reasonable? Is this pace humane? Is this pressure necessary? Instead, they ask a different question. What is wrong with me? That question has no end. There is always another flaw to refine, another habit to improve, another limit to push. But improvement without mercy becomes punishment. Rome never needed to punish everyone. It needed them to punish themselves. The tragedy is not that people tried to be better. It is that they were never allowed to be enough. Tonight's final truth is simple, but not easy. You are not on trial. You have been living as if you are. There is a difference. A trial implies guilt must be proven or disproven. But your life is not evidence. Your fatigue is not a confession. Your confusion is not an admission. Your hesitation is not proof of inadequacy. They are signals. Signals that you have been carrying weight. That does not belong entirely to you. Rome taught people to treat pressure as a test of character, but character does not grow under constant judgment. It shrinks. When everything must be justified, nothing can simply exist. Joy becomes suspicious. Rest becomes conditional. Stillness feels unsafe. This is not discipline. It is surveillance turned inward. And surveillance, even self-imposed, exhausts the soul. A verdict of not guilty does not mean nothing matters. It means something crucial ends. It means the assumption of fault stops. It means you no longer treat every struggle as evidence against yourself. It means you recognize that systems fail, conditions strain, and complexity produces friction without requiring moral blame. This recognition does not excuse harm. It clarifies responsibility. Responsibility does not mean absorbing everything. It means knowing what is yours to carry and what never was. Rome blurred that distinction deliberately. It taught people that maturity meant endurance, that adulthood meant silence, that worth meant compliance. But endurance without rest is not strength. Silence without choice is not wisdom. Compliance without consent is not virtue. You were never meant to be endlessly resilient. Resilience is a response to crisis, not a permanent state. A life lived as a continuous emergency will eventually forget how to breathe. This is why the verdict matters, not because it changes the world overnight, but because it changes how you stand inside it. When you stop assuming guilt, your posture shifts. You rest without apology. You pause without explanation. You question without panic. You still participate. You still contribute. You still care. But you do not confuse suffering with meaning. Rome needed people to believe that suffering was meaningful. That belief kept the system intact. Once suffering is understood as information rather than judgment, it loses its power to control. Understanding does not make life easy, but it makes it honest. You stop measuring yourself by impossible standards. You stop rehearsing defenses for your own existence. You stop living as if approval is always about to be revoked. A verdict of not guilty does not absolve responsibility. It restores proportion. You can be accountable without being condemned. You can learn without being shamed. You can improve without hating yourself. These distinctions were never encouraged. Rome thrived on confusion between discipline and worth, between error and identity, between pressure and purpose. Clarity weakens that confusion, and clarity is quiet. It does not shout. It does not demand rebellion. It does not promise transformation. It simply removes a lie. The lie that you must always be proving something. You do not need to earn rest. You do not need to justify limits. You do not need to explain why being human sometimes feels heavy. None of that makes you guilty. It makes you alive. Rome built systems that could outlast generations by training people to live under judgment. But judgment is not destiny. The trial only continues. If you keep returning to the courtroom, you are allowed to leave, not dramatically, not defiantly, quietly. By refusing to confuse exhaustion with failure, by refusing to turn pain into evidence, by refusing to sentence yourself for conditions you did not design. This is not escape, it is accuracy. Accuracy restores balance, and balance allows rest. So tonight, let the verdict stand. Not guilty, not because nothing went wrong, but because not everything that hurts is a crime. Not because you are perfect, but because perfection was never the standard. Only compliance was. You deserve to stop prosecuting yourself. You deserve to live without a permanent case file. You deserve moments that do not need to justify themselves. Rome's courts may never close, but yours can. And when they do, what remains is not chaos. It is space, space to breathe, space to notice, space to exist without explanation. That space is not laziness, it is freedom. Returning quietly to where it was always meant to be.